Alright, welcome to Teen Tales 2017. My name is Nikki Madigan. I'm the curator at the museum. And I'd also like to introduce Nathaniel Dolan Miller, who's our program and promotions coordinator. He's also our cameraman and video producer this season. And these presentations are filmed for the community record, and we make them available on our website about a week after the presentation. The theme of Teen Tales this year is Canada 150. We actually just had these donated, so it was perfect timing. And we'll be presenting 7 stories about Pemberton history in the context of Canadian history over the last 150 years. Some of the stories we're preparing this month are, next week we've got Lois Joseph and Georgina Nelson, who will be talking about the building of Mount Currie schools and saving Lil'wat culture and language. And then after that, we're going to have Roxy Kern tell us the seed potato story. It's your opportunity to ask any question you ever wanted answered about seed potatoes. Then staff are preparing a presentation about the gold rush and Canada in 1858. In August, we have Eric Anderson, who's going to be talking about Pemberton in the world news. So he's going through historic newspapers looking for Pemberton references. And we'll also see Johnny Jones, who's going to take us on a walk through Lil'wat territory. And finally, Brenda McLeod, who's the current president of the museum. She's also the chair of the Dyken District, is going to talk about flood control in Pemberton. We also wanted to thank our local presenters and volunteer bakers for their support for this program. And we wanted to thank you for joining us for another season. Today we wanted to kick things off with a look at Pemberton 60 years ago through the lens of an Allan King documentary that was produced for the CBC. And following the movie, we'll have a brief discussion about what was going on in Pemberton in 1957 and how that compares to other rural Canadian towns in 1957. And we encourage you to share your thoughts during this discussion, whether you're from Pemberton or not. We want to hear your ideas about Canada in 1957. I just want to give you a little biographical information about Allan King. So he was born in 1930 in Vancouver during the Depression, and he attended Henry Hudson Elementary School in Kitsilano. He graduated with honors from UBC with a degree in philosophy. He worked and lived in England for several years before he returned to Vancouver to work as a production assistant at the CBC. He made several short films for TV before the breakthrough success of Skid Row, a film about men living rough on Vancouver's poorest streets in 1956. Then he produced Pemberton Valley in 1957. So Pemberton Valley and Skid Row are 2 of his earliest works. I know. The Pemberton Valley is a lyrical look at life in rural BC, focusing on a farm family and on the nearby First Nations settlement. These 2 films resonate today with their compassion and poetry. He says he became a documentary filmmaker because, he says, I used to have a fantasy everyone would see my films and be changed for the better. That's why you want to make films. King was a leader of the documentary technique known as cinema verite, or truthful cinema. He ran Allan King Films Limited in Toronto. He describes his style as actuality drama, filming the drama of everyday life as it happens, spontaneously, without direction, interviews, or narrative. He says he strives to serve the action as unobtrusively as possible, and does so by becoming very familiar with the environment and people he films, by paying particular attention to movement patterns, routines, and light quality. King died from brain cancer on June 15, 2009, age 79, at his home in Toronto. Now, we edited the film slightly for length, so it'll play 50 minutes today, and then we'll have 10 minutes for discussion. If you want to see the movie in its full glory, it's on our website anytime. All right, we just wanted to talk a bit about what do you think was going on in Pemberton in 1957? And there were actually a few things in the movie that were major events for Pemberton. Electricity, right? He was cutting poles for BC Electric. We also saw the bud cars roll through.
Yep.
In 1956, finally, the rail line went from North Vancouver to Prince George. Prior to that, you had to take a steamship in Squamish to get to Vancouver. So getting to Vancouver was a 2-3 day affair. In 1950, big-scale logging started in Pemberton with Fleetwood Logging Company logging down along the lakes. And Cascade Fir started by George Walker in 1956. In 1950, the RCMP took over policing duties in the area. But it wasn't until '61 that a permanent detachment was built. Prior to that, the jail was the back room of today's Dyking District office. In 1953, now it's hard to see this in the movie, the roads were improved on Mount Henry. Yes, there was fresh gravel, and the worst of the potholes were filled in. In 1953, telephones came. Now there were only 12 listings. Do you want to know what they were?
Yeah.
We had the Van Beams, the Fowlers, the Deckers, the Ronans, Green, Miller, Faubourg, and Taylor. And then for businesses, we had the PGE, the Pemberton Co-op, the Pemberton Express, Warren's Store, Fleetwood Logging, and Walker. I mean, who else did you need to call? In 1956, the village of Pemberton was incorporated. Prior to that, there was no local government. Pemberton was part of the district of Lillooet, so the government office would have been in Lillooet. In 1957, a larger new elementary and high school opens in the fall, grade 1 to 12. So Roger Leo, a few years after, I think by 1960 then, Mount Currie children could go to high school locally. And that first few years of the school was grades 1 through 12 in that old high school building, which has been torn down now. In '58, the healthcare clinic was built. It was a centennial project. Then it became the public library, and then it became the youth center. That's what it is today. In 1958, there was finally a road from North Vancouver to Squamish. So that's a year after this film. And Pemberton went down to Squamish to lobby to bring the road north. They actually brought their cars down by train to drive around in Squamish to make the point. And then in 1963, a new elementary school was built by Magnus Erdl. And then the high school was the high school grades 8 through 12. For those of you not from Pemberton, what do you think was going on in rural Canada overall in 1957? There was a lot of farming, yeah, a lot of rural towns in Canada.
Probably similar, would you say?
I think it depends where and how close to urban centers you were, but one statistic I found said that Canada was a predominantly rural country until about 1940. And then after that, it has become an overwhelmingly urban one. So in 1941, 41% of Quebec francophones lived on a farm. By 1971, the number was only 6%. So with increased communication like roads, bridges, trains, youth left small towns and went to urban centers. Another statistic from Stats Can is that since 1941, the rural population has varied between 5.2 and 6.4 million. It's only increased marginally to reach 6.3 million. In the meantime, urban population has grown from 6 million in 1941 to 25 million in 2006. 6%, twice the rate of growth in rural areas. Something else to think of, what was going on in the 50s and 60s was the Cold War. So we found some civil defense evacuation procedure booklets from mid-1950s, duck and cover. And here on the West Coast, it was constantly talked about because it was the West Coast. Telephones had come into a lot of rural Canada. Big-scale logging was underway in lots of parts of Canada. Agriculture methods had changed and farm equipment was really changing. And you also had local municipal governments forming instead of these big districts, police forces, ambulance services, fire services in rural areas. And then we looked up just some notable things that happened in Canada in '57. John Diefenbaker was elected Prime Minister. McCain's French fries plant opened. Thanksgiving stat holiday was created. Elvis first performs in Canada. Ellen Lukes was appointed Secretary of State. She was the first female cabinet member in Canada. The first portion of the Trans-Canada was completed in Saskatchewan. Lester B. Pearson wins the Nobel Peace Prize. You ready for this? Poutine was first served in Warwick, Quebec. The Canada Arts Council was founded. The first Pub Wash Conference on Science and World Affairs was held, and organizers later received a Nobel Peace Prize and a Lenin Peace Prize for the conference. And Diefenbaker was the first sitting PM to address the UN General Assembly. Anybody else want to share some thoughts about 1957?
Was that the Sputnik unit?
Could be. I thought
That
that
had
was.
nothing to do with Canada.
58. No, it's
58.
I thought that was
57.
58.
58 was Sputnik.
No, it was 57, I was going to be called Spuddy because I was born.
Oh yeah.
It was striking to me the difference. I was in my last couple of years at high school and watching what was happening here compared to a suburb of London,
Yes.
England. It's so different.
Very rural.
But
Well, interesting enough, I was in a rural village and our milk came with a horse and carts, vegetables came out of truck. You know, the farmers would come round. Even the meat was brought in a truck around the streets and we went out and got it like that. And not all the roads were paved.
this is in England.
This was in England, yeah.
I remember getting ladled milk out of the big ovens at my grandmother's in Yorkshire.
And ice boxes would have been the norm.
Yes.
Ice
was kept under straw.
The Iceman would come.
And the milk that was delivered would freeze the winter, and it was like this, and we'd go around to all the neighbors and eat the tops off.
Oh, the
because it
cream
was
at
the
the
cream.
top. The bullets didn't get it first.
And without electricity, no running water. So you have the pump, the hand pump.
In the kitchen.
And I think, you know, if you think of an urban center in 1957, I know my mom grew up in a city, and I think rural Canada was considered pretty far behind urban centers in 1957, which might have been part of the allure of this documentary. Remember, you know, how it was, because this is what Canada would have looked like for 50 years, and urban centers were rapidly developing because everyone was moving there.
They didn't show any washroom facilities.
At the rodeo? No.
No, anywhere. Things like that.
It was a potato field.
Yeah.
That's why it was so rich.
They didn't have any workers. Compensation.
On your way out today, we actually have that same potato planter model just next to the general store. So imagine sitting on that for 11 days with a sharp knife. With a sharp knife. Whole day.
We do it in our kitchen, we were hired, and then they go into buckets and then go to the farm, because I lived in the town. So that's how we make some extra money. When I started picking potatoes at 15 for $5 a day, I think it was the hardest work I've ever done in my entire life. You know, because those bags, yeah, that's what we lived in.
They weighed as much as a bag of potatoes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's what.
Well, thank you very much for attending our first Teen Tales. Next week, we have Lois Joseph and Georgina Nelson talking about the building of Mount Curry Schools.